Welcome to CivilNet. I have a very, very special guest here in our studio. He is an award-winning, best-selling author, novelist, Chris Bohjalian. Chris, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you.
You are here in Armenia taking part in the Literary Ark, which is a festival now that's almost a decade long, brings writers and novelists from all over the world to Armenia. But before we talk about Literary Ark, we can't have an interview with Chris Bohjalian and not talk about the Sandcastles Girls, your best-selling novel, his sweeping love story, historical novel about the Armenian genocide. Now, for those Armenians who strangely only heard about you after Sandcastles Girls, I think it's important to note that you have written 18, so I'm behind even.
There'll be no exam, I promise.
Okay, good. 18 novels. Why was it important for you to write the book?
Sure. And I always think it's important to note that the Sandcastles Girls isn't the first time that I tried to write a novel of the Armenian genocide. I tried as a much younger writer in the 1990s, and I wrote the whole manuscript, 392 pages. And when I finished reading it, I realized it was a train wreck, a really bad book. I wasn't a mature enough novelist to manage this subject matter. Moreover, about this time, Carol Edgarian published her remarkable novel of the genocide, Rise of the Euphrates, and I thought to myself, we have the work of Carol Edgarian, Peter Balakian, Franz Werfel. Why does anyone need my take on this story? So I sent that manuscript to my college in Massachusetts, where if you are a scholar or a masochist, you can read it, but I would discourage you from doing so. So it was only in 2010 that I decided I needed to try again. And I tried again for a variety of reasons. As we all know, the story is profoundly important. There's a direct link between the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, what we are witnessing now in Syria. It's cataclysmic. But also because in the United States, the Armenian genocide in 2010 had become what my narrator in the novel calls the slaughter you know next to nothing about. And yet once upon a time, all Canadian and American eyes were turned upon the fraying edges of the Ottoman Empire and looking on aghast. And so yes, I did try again in 2010, and this time I will not be so presumptuous as to say I got it right, but I did a better job.
You have said that this is probably the most important book you'll ever write. And yet, 10 years prior to that, when you attempted to do it, and I dare say there are several people, several Armenians who have attempted to write it and haven't been able to. What changed in your life in that decade?
I lost a lot of hair. I grew a little gray, certainly. And the reality is that when you lose a little hair, when you get a little gray, you understand perspective a little better. I wrote at least 7 or 8 novels in between, and I got better at my craft. And I also understood 2 fundamental things I hadn't realized earlier. First of all, I needed to put the Armenian genocide in context. There needed to be a narrator who could say to North Americans, this cataclysmic crime occurred in 1915 and you don't know about it, and you must. And the narrator can explain, there's a reason you don't know. Don't feel like a dummy. It's a century of denial, and here are the reasons why, beginning of course with Turkey and then enabled by, among others, my country, the United States. That was the first thing I understood. You can't tell this story without framing it. Secondly, I realized that no one in the United States is going to buy a book called 1.5 Million Dead in the Desert. It's just never going to happen. But we all love big, sweeping, epic love stories, books like The English Patient and Atonement. And so I realized that I need to frame this in a love story. I love love stories, and so I created a love story in Aleppo in 1915, the grandparents of a narrator who can educate Americans to the genocide. And I think that's why the book worked better now than that much earlier, very different draft I tried as a young man.
You know, we just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. I know that you have been to Western Armenia, if I'm not mistaken, on several occasions.
3 times now.
3 times now. So have I. And yet it took 3 generations for this sort of, I don't think it's fair to say that the gates have opened and the floodgates have opened, and now we're seeing more and more descendants of survivors writing stories based on personal experiences, but also creating human interest stories that appeal to a global audience and at the same time educate them. Why did it take us so long? Why haven't we been able to write the stories? Because again, I think there is a story in every family, Armenian family on this planet.
I think what you're saying is absolutely right and really smart. First of all, I'm really proud of our community around the world because I feel suddenly like we are winning the public relations war. In 2010, Laura Petrosian in my novel can call it the slaughter you know next to nothing about. I think thanks to the work of Armenian individuals, Armenian activists, Armenians in the media, all of a sudden that's not quite as true. I think a lot of people now know about the Armenian genocide, and I obviously have to give a huge shout out to Pope Francis and Kim Kardashian, who were instrumental in that in the United States.
All over the world.
All over the world, yeah. So I think that's one factor. The centennial was a game changer. The media and human nature both gravitate to a soundbite. We gravitate to what's simple. And certainly the centennial gave me personally an opportunity to talk about it in essays, in newspapers and magazines that I wouldn't have otherwise have had. Secondly, you talked about generations, and I think you're absolutely right. My father, for instance, wanted only to be American. He was the son of 2 survivors. But for him, it was all about New York City, it was all about suburbs of New York City, advertising and baseball, and he was a wonderful father, and I loved him so much. But he was first and foremost American. I was 14 years old before I discovered he spoke Armenian fluently. And so maybe it's that 3rd generation that can circle back around and say, what did we miss? Now, it's important to note, though, that there are obviously Armenians who didn't wait for the 3rd generation, who were going to Camp Hyaston, 40, 35 years ago, and I don't want to neglect that reality. But I think there is something about that 3rd generation circling back around.
Yeah, certainly, and it was indicative of your father's generation that we see time and time again. They weren't taught Armenian oftentimes, and if they did, they chose to forget it. And they needed to become part of American mainstream, so that perhaps it was a defense mechanism. I want to talk about how you felt when you went to Western Armenia, if we could briefly. I know you could probably fill 3 volumes of your thoughts and experiences there, but what did it mean to you? And did you go after you wrote the book or before?
The first time I went was just before the book was published.
But you had already written the book?
Yes, yes. And in my subsequent visits, well, that first visit and in my subsequent visits, I'm always struck by this sensation that I feel unexpectedly rooted. That's the first reality. When I went to Kayseri for the first time, brought there by my great friend and a man I view as a godfather, even though he's so much younger than me, Hachig Maradian, he brought my wife and me to Kayseri, where the Bohjalians are from. And as we were standing by the ruins of the church, my wife observed, "You are breathing the air right now that your grandfather was breathing when he was baptized here. This was the air that your great-grandfather Nazareth was breathing." And so on the one hand, it is deeply and profoundly moving. On the other hand, it is a world of ruins and unmarked mass graves, places like the Dudon Crevasse, where 10,000 of our ancestors were slaughtered over a 3-day period, their bodies unceremoniously left in the ditch. and you feel anger and fury at the cataclysmic injustice of it. And then there's this strange sense of pride commingling with that injustice that once upon a time, this was some of the most amazing medieval architecture, and now it's in ruins. But it was once majestic, and it was ours. And then you visit a place like St. Sarkis, a 5-church monastery in Digor, not far from here, just over the border, just south of Ani. And that was a complex that, as late as the 1950s, was fully intact. It was dynamited in the 1950s. Because it's not enough to ethnically cleanse us from an area. Any trace that we once were there needs to be expunged as well. So I guess I'm just a riot of emotions when I'm there. But I'm always drawn back.
Are you drawn back, and does it make you want to work harder?
Yeah. I mean, it does make me want to work harder. It makes me want to work harder for justice.
In general. And I think that's the one thing that, I think, you know, you said earlier about the 100th anniversary being a game changer for the world and the media, but it was also a game changer for us, I think.
Yeah, it was.
I think something shifted in our collective narrative and our collective consciousness, and we understood that. For me personally, for example, the 100th anniversary represented not only the pain, the suffering, the loss, but it was a chance to renew and to say, I survived, we all survived, and look at what we can accomplish.
And I hope now the diaspora will not simply look to our ancestors and the whispers that raise up from the Dudown crevasse, but think of our children here in Armenia. The last couple of days, thanks to the Literary Ark, I've had the opportunity to visit universities in Yerevan. And every time I spend time with young people in this country, I feel revitalized because they are so friggin' amazing.
They're brilliant.
And we in the diaspora need to have this country's back.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to be the greatest friends, Chris Bohjalian. But final question, because you are here for Literary Ark, you mentioned that you've been to several universities, met with the young people, but tell me, why do you feel that this is a worthwhile endeavor, initiative, to come all the way to Armenia to take part in?
Well, it's worthwhile for me for different reasons than it's worthwhile for some other writers. Many of these other writers know very, very little about Armenia, and they're seeing our culture for the first time. They are getting introduced to our beautiful music. They're getting introduced to our classical poetry. They're seeing what is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Yerevan, as well as some of our most beautiful monasteries and churches. And they're getting a taste for how remarkable this country can be, which hopefully will then be manifest in their poetry, in their work, as they become apostles for Armenia. For me, it's an opportunity to reconnect, to have a chance to come home, to see you, to be here.
Well, may you continually be the apostle of the Armenian nation. Thank you so much. Thank you for not only writing this book, but for expressing things in ways that some of us can't. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was novelist, author Chris Bohjalian. Keep following CivilNet.